Imagine a peaceful English village, St. Mary Mead, where roses bloom and neighbors smile, till cruel. Anonymous letters shatter the calm, accusing everyone from the colonel to the maid of shocking secrets. Enter Miss Jane Marple, a quiet, knitting spinster with a razor-sharp mind. As fear tears her village apart, she uncovers a web of forged antiques, stolen church funds, and blackmail, all tied to a limping conman. With clever traps and keen eyes, Miss Marple unmasks the villain. Saving her home is a tale of secrets, suspense, and one woman's unstoppable quest for truth. Chapter 1. A quiet village stirred St. Mary Mead was a picture of calm, a little village tucked in the English countryside where nothing much ever happened. Roses climbed over stone walls, their petals bright against the gray. The church bells rang softly, marking the hours with a gentle chime that floated over the green. Sparrows chirped in the hedges, and the air smelled of fresh grass and baking bread from Mrs. Baker's cottage. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where a new hat or a missed Sunday service sparked talk for weeks. Miss Jane Marple lived in a neat house at the edge of the village, the garden full of flowers she tended with care. She was a small woman with white hair tied in a bun and eyes that missed nothing. Her hands were always busy, knitting soft scarves or shawls, while she sat by her window watching the world go by. That morning she was working on a pale pink shawl, the needles clicking in a steady rhythm. The sun warmed her face, and a cup of tea steamed on the table beside her. Everything seemed perfect. But Miss Marple's sharp mind sensed a ripple in the village's peace. She noticed it first when Mrs. Price, the postmistress, hurried past her gate. Mrs. Price was a round, cheerful woman who usually stopped to chat about the weather or her roses. Today her face was red, her steps quick, and her hands clutched a bundle of letters as if they might bite. She didn't wave or smile. Instead, she leaned close to Mrs. Hartnell, the butcher's wife, who was sweeping her doorstep. Their heads bent together, and Miss Marple caught snatches of their whispers. Dreadful letter, and such a shock. Mrs. Hartnell's broom stopped mid-sweep, her mouth open like a fish. Mrs. Price shook her head and scurried on. Leaving Mrs. Hartnell staring after her, Miss Marple's needles slowed. A dreadful letter. That wasn't the usual village gossip about who bought too much sugar or whose dog dug up the vicar's tulips. Letters carried weight. They could hold secrets, promises, or trouble. Her mind flicked back to stories she'd heard, letters that stirred up old grudges or spilled hidden truths. She sipped her tea, the cup warm in her hands, and watched Mrs. Hartnell rush inside, no doubt to tell her husband. The village was waking up, and something was wrong by noon. St. Mary Mead was humming with talk. Miss Marple didn't need to leave her garden to hear it. The milkman, Tom, lingered at the gate of the Blue Boar Inn, his bottles clinking as he spoke to the barmaid. "Jenny, heard about the letters?" he said, his voice low but carrying on the breeze. Jenny nodded, her eyes wide. "Mrs. Dane Calthrop. Got one? And she's fit to burst." Tom moved on, and Jenny darted inside, likely to spread the news. Across the green, two women stood by the postbox, their heads closed, their voices sharp with worry. Even the sparrows seemed louder, as if they sensed the village's unease. Miss Marple set her knitting in her lap and thought. Mrs. Dane Calthrop was the vicar's wife, a kind woman with a loud laugh and a habit of wearing mismatched shoes. Why would she get a dreadful letter? And who else had one? The village was small, with barely 100 souls, but secrets grew like weeds in places like this. Miss Marple knew that better than most. People thought she was just a sweet old lady who liked tea and gossip, but her mind was a trap, catching every detail, every glance, every word that didn't fit. She stood, brushing a petal from her skirt, and went inside to make more tea. Her kitchen was cozy, with blue curtains and a kettle that whistled like a bird. As the water boiled, she thought about letters. They weren't new in St. Mary Mead. Years ago, a girl named Elsie got a love letter from a boy who left for London, and her mother cried for days. Then there was the time Mr. Pye, the antiques dealer, got a letter about a debt, and his face turned gray as he read it. But those were personal, expected. These new letters felt different, like a storm cloud over the village. She carried her tea back to the garden and sat, her eyes scanning the street. Mr. Pye himself walked by, his bright scarf flapping like a flag. He was a fussy man, always talking about his silver spoons and old paintings. Today, he looked nervous, his hands stuffed in his pockets, his steps too fast for a stroll. Miss Marple tilted her head. Had he gotten a letter too? She made a note in her mind, a little tally of names. Mrs. Dane Calthrop, maybe Mr. Pye, who else? The church clock struck 1, and the village settled for lunch. Miss Marple nibbled a biscuit, her thoughts racing. She remembered a story from another village, Limstock, where nasty letters caused all sorts of trouble. They weren't just mean words, they hid something bigger, like a fox hiding in the bushes. She wondered if these letters were the same. Were they just someone's spite, or were they covering up a secret? Her fingers itched to find out, but she knew patience was key. The village would tell her more if she waited. By afternoon, the gossip spread like wildfire. Miss Marple walked to the shop to buy sugar, her basket swinging on her arm. The shop was crowded, voices overlapping. Mrs. Baker, the baker's wife, was there, her apron dusted with flour. It's a disgrace, Che said, her hands on her hips. Poor Mary, the vicarage maid, got one, accusing her of stealing. She's just a girl. Mrs. Weatherby, who ran the sewing circle, nodded. And Dr. Haydock got one too, saying he's careless with patients. Can you imagine? Miss Marple listened, her face calm but her mind sharp. Mary, the maid, was barely 16, with big eyes and a shy smile. Dr. Haydock was gruff but kind, always carrying peppermints for children. I target them. She paid for her sugar and stepped outside, pausing by the postbox. It was red and sturdy, bolted to the ground near the green. Letters went in there every evening, collected at dawn. Whoever sent these must have come at night when the village slept. She squinted at the slot, wondering if it held any clues. Back home, she sat by her window again, her knitting forgotten. The village was unraveling, thread by thread. Neighbors who once shared jam recipes now glanced at each other with suspicion. Mrs. Hartnell snapped at the milkman for being late. Mr. Pye avoided the Blue Boar, where he usually bragged about his antiques. Even the children were quiet, sensing the grown-ups' worry. Miss Marple felt a pang of sadness. St. Mary Mead was her home, and someone was tearing it apart. She thought about the letter's writer. They had to be clever, knowing so much about everyone. Had to be bold, sneaking out at night to post their poison. And they had to be angry, to want to hurt so many people. Miss Marple knew anger like that didn't come from nowhere. Grew from jealousy or betrayal or a secret too heavy to keep. She closed her eyes, picturing the village like a map. The vicarage where Mrs. Dane Calthrop lived. The doctor's house, with its tidy lawn. Mr. Pye's shop, full of glittering treasures. Somewhere in those places, or beyond, was the answer. The sun dipped low, painting the sky pink. Miss Marple lit a lamp and made notes in a small book. She wrote letters at the top, then listed names. Mrs. Dane Calthrop, Mr. Pye, Mary. Dr. Haydock. She added posted at night and knows secrets. She tapped her pencil, thinking. The writer was close. Maybe someone she saw every day. They walked these streets, smiled at neighbors, and hid their hate behind a friendly face. That thought made her shiver, but it also made her determined. She stood and stretched, her joints creaking. The village was quiet now, the green empty except for a cat slinking through the shadows. Miss Marple locked her door and drew the curtains. But she didn't go to bed. She sat by the lamp, her book open, her mind turning over every detail. The letters were just the start, she was sure. They were like the first crack in a dam, and if she didn't find the truth, the whole village might flood with trouble. As the clock struck 10, she heard footsteps outside. She peeked through the curtain, her heart quick. A figure moved toward the postbox, their coat dark, their head down. They slipped something in and hurried away, too fast for her to see their face. Miss Marple's breath caught. Another letter. The writer was still at work, and the village's peace was slipping further away. She sat back, her hands folded. Tomorrow, she'd talk to Mrs. Dane Calthrop, maybe visit the post office. She'd watch and listen, as she always did. The village thought she was just a nosy old lady, but Miss Marple knew better. She was a hunter, tracking truth through whispers and glances. And this time, she'd catch whoever was poisoning St. Mary Mead. The lamp flickered, and the night grew. Still, Miss Marple smiled faintly. The game was on, and she was ready. Chapter 2. The first Clutha morning sun spilled over St. Mary Mead, turning the dew on the grass to tiny diamonds. The village looked peaceful, with smoke curling from chimneys and the scent of fresh bread drifting from Mrs. Baker's cottage. But the air felt heavy, like the moment before a storm. Miss Jane Marple sat at her kitchen table, sipping tea and nibbling a scone. Her knitting lay folded beside her, the pale pink shawl growing stitch by stitch. She'd slept little, her mind buzzing with thoughts of the poisoned pen letters that had shaken the village. Today she'd start hunting for answers. She'd heard more at the shop yesterday. The letters were cruel, accusing people of things that made their cheeks burn. Mrs. Dane Calthrop, the vicar's wife, was said to have stolen church money. Dr. Haydock was called careless with patience. Mary, the young maid, was branded a thief. Mr. Pye, the antiques dealer, was whispered to have faked his precious silver. Each letter was a dagger, sharp and personal, and Miss Marple knew they weren't random. Someone with a grudge was behind them. Someone who knew the village's secrets too well. She finished her tea and tucked her notebook into her basket. It was a small book, leather-bound, where she jotted names and clues. Last night she'd seen a figure at the postbox slipping in another letter. They'd moved fast, their coat dark, their steps quiet. She hadn't seen their face, but the image stuck in her mind like a photograph. Today she'd visit the Women's Institute meeting, where the village women would gather to plan the summer fair. Gossip would flow like tea, and Miss Marple's ears would be open. She put on her hat, a sensible straw one with a blue ribbon, and walked to the village hall. The street was busy. Children ran past, chasing a ball, their laughter sharp against the grown-ups' hushed voices. Mrs. Hartnell stood by her gate talking to the milkman, Tom. "It's a shame," she said, her voice carrying. Poor Mrs. Calthrop, crying her eyes out. Tom nodded, his bottles clinking. Miss Marple paused, pretending to adjust her basket. Mrs. Calthrop crying. That was new. The vicar's wife was tough, with a big heart and a bigger laugh. A letter. Must have cut deep to shake her at the hall. The Women's Institute meeting was already underway. The room smelled of polish and flowers, with tables set for tea and biscuits. Women sat in clusters, their voices low but sharp. Miss Marple slipped in quietly, taking a seat near the back. Mrs. Weatherby, who ran the sewing circle, was speaking about bunting for the fair, but her eyes kept darting to Mrs. Dane Calthrop, who sat by the window. Mrs. Calthrop looked pale, her hands twisting a handkerchief. Her usual bright scarf was missing, and her shoes, always mismatched, were a dull gray pair today. Miss Marple watched, her face soft but her mind racing. Mrs. Calthrop wasn't herself. She leaned toward Miss Emily Barton, the elderly spinster, who lived in a cottage by the church. Miss Barton patted her arm, whispering something. Miss Marple made a mental note. Mrs. Calthrop was confiding in Miss Barton. That could mean trust or something else. She'd learned long ago that kindness could hide secrets. When the meeting broke for tea, Miss Marple moved closer. She picked up a cup and saucer, smiling at Mrs. Calthrop. "Lovely day, isn't it?" she said, her voice gentle. Mrs. Calthrop started, her handkerchief fluttering. "Oh, Miss Marple, yes, I suppose." Her eyes were red and her smile wobbled. Miss Marple sipped her tea, waiting. People often spilled their worries if you gave them space. Mrs. Calthrope glanced around, then leaned in. "Jane, have you heard about these awful letters?" She whispered. Miss Marple nodded, her face kind. "A bit, dear. Such a nasty business." Mrs. Calthrope's hands shook. "I got one. It says I stole church funds money for the orphans fund. It's lies, but it knows things, Jane. Dates, amounts, like someone's been watching." Voice cracked, and she dabbed her eyes. Miss Marple patted her arm, her touch light but firm. There, it's just spite, I'm sure. But tell me, what did the letter look like?" Mrs. Calthrope sniffed. "It was typed on plain paper. No signature, just my name on the envelope. Posted here with a St. Mary Mead mark." Oh, Miss Marple's heart quickened. Typed, not handwritten. That was a clue. Typewriters weren't common in the village, and they left marks as unique as fingerprints. She filed it away, next to the figure at the postbox. She stayed at the meeting another hour, listening as the women talked. Mrs. Baker mentioned Mary, the maid, who was too scared to leave the vicarage. Mrs. Weatherby said Dr. Haydock was furious, tearing up his letter in front of patients. Miss Barton, quiet as ever, said little but watched everyone. Miss Marple noticed her eyes linger on Mrs. Calthrope, sharp and curious. Was it worry or something more? Back home, Miss Marple sat in her garden, her notebook open. She wrote letters typed local postmark, specific details. She added Mrs. Calthrope's name and the accusation about church funds. The details were key. The writer knew exact sums and dates, which meant they had access to records or someone close to the church. The vicarage was a busy place, with cleaners, choir boys, and visitors. Anyone could have overheard something. She thought about typewriters. Not many people had them. The vicarage might, for sermons or letters. Mr. Pye, with his fancy shop, could own one for invoices. Miss Barton, who rented out her cottage, had lived in London once. Maybe she'd kept an old machine. Miss Marple tapped her pencil. She'd need to check, but carefully. People got touchy when you poked into their things. She decided to visit the post office. Mrs. Price, the postmistress, was a goldmine of gossip, and she'd know about the letters' postmarks. Miss Marple put on her coat, a soft gray one, and walked to the village square. The post office was small, with a counter piled high with parcels and stamps. Mrs. Price stood behind it, sorting mail, her face still flushed from yesterday. "Morning, Miss Marple," she called, her voice too bright. "Need stamps." Miss Marple smiled. "Just a few, dear. And a chat, if you've time." Mrs. Price loved to talk, and soon she was spilling details. "These letters are a nightmare," she said, stamping an envelope with a thud. "Dozens of them, all posted here. They come in late, after dark, when I'm not around. I only see the postmark when I sort the morning mail." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes on the counter. "Late at night." "That's odd. Who's out then?" Mrs. Price leaned closer, her voice low. "Exactly. The village is dead by 9. Whoever's posting them is sneaky, dropping them in the box and vanishing, and they're typed, every one. No handwriting to trace." Miss Marple's pulse jumped. Typed local, posted at night. The clues were piling up, but they pointed to a shadow, not a face. She bought her stamps and left, her mind turning. The writer was careful, using a typewriter to hide their hand, posting at night to avoid eyes. But they weren't invisible. The figures she'd seen last night proved that. She pictured them again. Dark coat, quick steps, maybe a hood. They knew the village's rhythm, when it slept and when it woke. That meant they lived here, walked these streets, smiled at neighbors. The thought made her stomach twist. Back home, she sat by her window, watching the green. The village looked normal, children playing, Mr. Pye sweeping his shop step, Mrs. Hartnell hanging laundry. But it wasn't. The letters were like poison seeping into every home. Miss Marple knew. They weren't just mean words. In Limstock years ago, letters like these had hidden a crema theft, a betrayal, She suspected the same here. The accusations were too pointed, too clever. They were a distraction, like smoke hiding a fire. She opened her notebook and added, "Night poster knows village well." She thought about Mrs. Calthrop's letter. The church funds were real money, collected every Sunday. Only a few people handled it. The vicar, Mrs. Calthrop, maybe the treasurer. Mr. Giles? Could one of them be the writer, stirring trouble to cover something else? Or was it an outsider, someone watching from the edges? The clock struck 3, and Miss Marple made more tea. She needed to talk to Mrs. Calthrop again, maybe see the letter itself. She'd also ask about the vicarage typewriter. But she had to be gentle. People clammed up if you pushed too hard. She thought about Mary, the maid. Why target a girl like her? Mary was quiet, barely noticed. Maybe she'd seen something, heard something without knowing it. Miss Marple made a note to invite her for tea. As the sun dipped, casting long shadows across the green, Miss Marple felt a spark of excitement. The letters were a puzzle, and she loved puzzles. Its clue was a piece, each whisper a hint. She'd find the writer not by chasing them, but by listening, watching, waiting. The village was her map, and she knew every corner. She closed her notebook and stood, her joints stiff. Tonight, she'd watch the postbox again. The figure might return, and this time, she'd be ready. She lit a lamp, its glow warm against the dusk, and settled by the window. The village was quiet, but Miss Marple's mind was alive, spinning threads of truth from the chaos. The writer thought they were clever, but they didn't know St. Mary Mead had Jane Marple, and she was cleverer. Still. Chapter 3, A Village Divided. The sun rose over St. Mary Mead, painting the rooftops gold, but the village felt cold, as if a shadow clung to its stones. Roses still bloomed, and the church bells chimed, but the air buzzed with fear. Miss Jane Marple sat in her parlor, her knitting in her lap, a cup of tea cooling on the table. Her sharp eyes flicked to the window, where the green lay quiet. The poison pen letters had spread like a sickness, and the village was cracking under there. Wait. She'd learned more yesterday, typed letters posted at night full of cruel truths and lies. Today she'd dig deeper, chasing the threads that tied them together. She opened her notebook, its pages filled with neat handwriting. Mrs. Dane Calthrop accused of stealing church funds. Dr. Haydock called careless with patients. Mary, the vicarage maid, branded a thief. Mr. Pye whispered to have faked his antiques. And now, new names whispered at the Women's Institute. Colonel Bantry, accused of an affair, and Miss Emily Barton hinted at dodging taxes. Each letter was a wound, tearing at the village's heart. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind sharp. The writer wasn't just mean, they were clever, picking targets to sow chaos. She thought about the figure she'd seen at the postbox 2 nights ago, slipping in a letter under the cover of dark. Their coat was heavy, their steps quick but uneven, like a limp. She hadn't seen their face, but she'd watch again tonight. The writer was bold, moving through a sleeping village, but bold people made mistakes. Miss Marple knew that from years of watching St. Mary Mead, where secrets hid behind smiles. She stood, brushing crumbs from her skirt, and put on her coat. The village was awake, and she needed to hear its pulse. She walked to the green, her basket swinging, her straw hat tilted against the sun. The street was busy, but tense. Mrs. Hartnell snapped at a boy who ran too close to her laundry. Mr. Pye stood outside his shop, his bright scarf dull today, his eyes darting like a cornered cat. Even the children were quiet, their games half-hearted. Miss Marple felt a pang. St. Mary Mead was her home, and someone was breaking it. She stopped by the Blue Boar Inn, where Jenny, the barmaid, was wiping tables. "Morning, Miss Marple," Jenny said, her smile thin. "Heard the latest?" Miss Marple tilted her head, inviting more. Jenny leaned close, her voice low. "Colonel Bantry got a letter saying he's sweet on some actress in London. Mrs. Bantry laughed it off, but she's not herself. Miss Marple nodded, her face kind, but her mind racing. Colonel Bantry was a bluff, red-faced man who loved his garden and his wife, Dolly. An affair. Unlikely, but the letter knew something. Or it wouldn't sting. She thanked Jenny and moved on, her steps slow but deliberate. At the post office, Mrs. Price was sorting mail, her hands quick but her face tired. More letters came, she muttered when Miss Marple asked. Posted late, same as before. I'm sick of seeing them. Miss Marple bought a postcard. Her. Eyes on the counter, all typed, she asked. Mrs. Price nodded. Every one. And they're mean. Picking at folks' worst fears. Miss Marple filed that away. Typed, local, vicious. The writer was close, maybe someone she passed every day. Back on the green, she saw Mrs. Dane Calthrop hurrying toward the vicarage, her scarf slipping off her shoulder. Her face was pale, her eyes red. Miss Marple caught up, her voice soft. Are you all right, dear? Mrs. Calthrop stopped, her hands twisting. No, Jane, I'm not. Another letter came worse than the first. Says I've been lying to the vicar, hiding money for years. Her voice broke and she looked away. Miss Marple patted her arm. It's nonsense, I'm sure. But may I see it? Mrs. Calthrop hesitated, then nodded. Come to the vicarage later. I kept it. Miss Marple walked home, her mind turning. The letters were piling up, each one sharper than the last. They didn't just accuse, they knew things. Like the church. Funds exact sums or Colonel Bantry's London trips. That meant the writer had eyes and ears everywhere, or access to private places. She thought about Mary, the maid. Why target a girl who barely spoke? Maybe Mary had seen something a paper. A conversation that the writer wanted hidden at home. She sat in her garden, the roses bright around her. She opened her notebook and wrote, more letters, same style, Colonel Bantry, Miss Barton. Specific secrets. She tapped her pencil thinking. The village was splitting apart. Neighbors who once shared tea now avoided each other. Mrs. Hartnell hadn't spoken too. Mrs. Baker since the letter started. Mr. Pye stayed in his shop, his door half closed. Even the vicarage felt tense, with Mary hiding in the kitchen. Marple knew fear like this could ruin a place. Turning friends into strangers. She thought back to Limstock, a village she'd visited years ago. Their poison pen letters had caused fights, tears, even a death. They weren't just spite. They hid a bigger crime, a theft covered by chaos. Miss Marple suspected the same here. The letters were too clever, too focused. They hit the villages. Pillars, the vicar's wife, the doctor, the colonel. But why Mary? She was no pillar, just a quiet girl who scrubbed floors. Miss Marple made a note to talk to her. Maybe tomorrow she decided to visit the vicarage now, to see Mrs. Calthrop's. Letter. She put on her hat again and walked across the green. The vicarage was a big, rambling house, its windows open to the breeze. Mrs. Calthrop answered the door, her face still pale. Come in, Jane, she said, leading her to the parlor. The room was cozy, with chintz curtains and a fire crackling. On the table lay the letter, a single sheet of cheap paper. Its words typed in black dot. Miss Marple slipped on her glasses and read. The letter was short but brutal, accusing Mrs. Calthrop of hiding church money in a secret account. It listed dates last. June, August, November and sums. £10, 5/8. It's lies, Mrs. Calthrop said, her voice shaking. But those dates match our collections. How do they know? Miss Marple folded the letter, her mind sharp. The writer had access to records, or someone who talked too much. She noticed the typeface, crisp and even, with a slightly crooked E. That was a clue a typewriter's quirk could point to its owner. She thanked Mrs. Calthrop and left, promising to help. On the way home, she passed Mr. Pye's shop. He was outside polishing a silver tray, his hands nervous. Good day, Mr. Pye, she called. He jumped, nearly dropping the tray. "Oh, Miss Marple, yes, good day." His smile was forced, his eyes flicking to the street. Miss Marple noted it. He was scared. Maybe of another letter? She'd visit him soon under the guise of admiring his antiques. Back home. She sat by her window, the green fading into dusk. The village was quiet, but the silence felt heavy, like a held breath. She opened her notebook and added, "Letter at Vicarage, typed crooked E. Knows church dates." She thought about typewriters again. The vicarage had one, she'd seen it in the study. Mr. Pye might, for his business. Miss Barton, who'd lived in cities, could own one too. She'd need to check, but discreetly. She made tea, the kettle's whistles sharp in the quiet. As it steeped, she thought about the village's mood. Fear was spreading, and with it, distrust. Mrs. Baker had stopped inviting Mrs. Weatherby for tea. Dr. Haydock snapped at patients, his temper short. Even the children felt it, their laughter gone. Miss Marple knew a village could break under this weight, its bonds snapping like threads. She wouldn't let that happen. She thought about the writer. They were angry, yes, but also cunning, using the letters to stir trouble. Why? To hurt or to hide something bigger? She remembered Limstock again, where letters distracted from a theft. Here, it could be money or a secret, maybe a scandal tied to the church. Or Mr. Pye's antiques, or Colonel Bantry's trips. She made a note, letters as cover. Check church, antiques, London. The clock struck 7 and the sky turned pink. Miss Marple lit a lamp and settled by the window, her eyes on the postbox. She'd watch again tonight, hoping the figure returned. She pictured them, dark coat, uneven steps, a shadow in the night. They thought they were safe. But Miss Marple was watching, her mind a net, catching every clue. As the village slept, she stayed awake, her tea cold, her notebook open. The letters were a storm, but she was the calm at its center. She'd find the writer, not by running, but by waiting, listening, seeing. St. Mary Mead was her world. And she'd protect it. One quiet step at a time. Chapter 4. The typewriter trail. The morning mist hung low over St. Mary Mead, cloaking the village in a soft gray veil. Roses drooped under the damp, and the church bells sounded muffled, as if reluctant to break the quiet. Miss Jane Marple sat at her kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a warm teacup, her knitting folded neatly beside her. The pale pink shawl was growing, stitch by careful stitch, but her mind was far from wool. The poison pen letters had tightened their grip on the village, and last night's watch at the postbox had yielded nothing, no shadowy figure, no new clue. Yet Miss Marple felt the puzzle shifting, pieces falling into place. Today she'd chase a lead that hummed in her thoughts. The typewriter, her notebook lay open, its pages crowded with notes. The letters were typed, posted at night, and cruelly precise, accusing Mrs. Dane Calthrop of stealing church funds, Dr. Haydock of neglecting patients, Mary the maid of theft, Mr. Pye of faking antiques, Colonel Bantry of an affair, and Miss Emily Barton of dodging taxes. Each one bore a St. Mary Mead postmark and a typewriter's crisp print, with a crooked E she'd noticed in Mrs. Calthrop's letter. That quirk was a fingerprint, and Miss Marple knew typewriters were rare. In a village this small, find the machine and she'd be closer to the writer. She sipped her tea, the steam curling in the cool air. The village was fracturing. Neighbors who once swapped recipes now whispered behind hands. Mrs. Hartnell hadn't spoken to Mrs. Baker in days. Mr. Pye kept his shop's blinds half drawn. Even the vicarage, usually warm with laughter, felt cold. Mary hiding in the kitchen and Mrs. Calthrop's eyes red from crying. Miss Marple's heart ached for St. Mary Mead. But her mind was sharp, slicing through the fog of fear. The letters weren't just spite, they were a mask, hiding something bigger, like a theft or a scandal. She'd seen it before in Limstock, where poison pen letters cloaked a crime. Here she suspected the same. She stood, her joints creaking, and put on her gray coat and straw hat. Her nephew, Raymond West, was visiting with his wife, Joan, staying at the Blue Boar Inn. Raymond was a writer, full of big ideas and city ways. But he adored his aunt and never minded her little errands. She'd ask him to poke around about typewriters. Young men could charm answers out of anyone. She wrote a quick note. "Raymond, dear, could you ask about typewriters in the village?" Discreetly, of course. Sta sealed it and tucked it in too. Her basket along with her notebook. The village was stirring as she stepped outside. The mist was lifting, revealing the green and the stone walls laced with ivy. Children scampered to school, their voices muted. Mrs. Price hurried toward the post office, her arms full of parcels. Miss Marple waved, but Mrs. Price only nodded, her face tight. More letters, Miss Marple thought. The writer hadn't stopped. She walked to the inn, her steps steady, eyes scanning the street. Mr. Pye stood outside his shop polishing a brass lamp, his hands jerky. He looked up, saw her, and ducked inside. Scared, she noted, of another letter or something else. The Blue Boar, Jenny the barmaid, was sweeping the steps. "Morning, Miss Marple," she said, her smile faint. "Your nephew's in the parlor, writing something?" Miss Marple thanked her and found Raymond at a table, scribbling in a notebook, his dark hair flopping over his eyes. Joan sat nearby, sketching flowers. "Aunt Jane," Raymond said, standing, "what brings you here? Another mystery?" His tone was teasing, but his eyes were kind. Miss Marple smiled, handing him the note. "Just a small favor, dear. Read. This when you're alone." Ramond raised an eyebrow but nodded, tucking the note into his pocket. She stayed a moment, chatting about the weather, then left, her basket lighter. Raymond would dig, and she trusted his knack for getting people to talk. Now she'd visit Miss Emily Barton, the spinster, who'd gotten a letter about taxes. Barton was prim, private. An old-fashioned perfect for owning a typewriter from her London days. The walk to Miss Barton's cottage took her past the church, where the vicar, Mr. Calthrop, was clipping hedges. His face was drawn, his scissors slow. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, his voice heavy. "Nasty business, these letters." She nodded, her expression soft. "Very nasty. How's your wife?" His jaw tightened. "Set. Another came yesterday, worse than the first." Miss Marple's pulse quickened. "May I see it later, perhaps?" He hesitated, then nodded. "Come by this afternoon." She thanked him and moved on, her mind noting another letter, same target. The writer was relentless. Miss Barton's cottage was small, with lace curtains and a garden of tidy roses. Miss Marple knocked, and Miss Barton answered, her gray hair pinned tightly, her dress starched. "Miss Marple, what a surprise," she said, her voice high. Her eyes flicked to the street, nervous. "May I come in?" Miss Marple asked. Miss Barton nodded, leading her to a parlor that smelled of lavender and wax. A fire crackled, and on a desk in the corner sat an old typewriter, its keys dusty under a cloth. They sat with tea, the cups clinking softly. Miss Marple steered the talk to the letters. "Such a shame about these notes," she said, her tone light. Miss Barton's hands shook, spilling a drop of tea. "I got one," she admitted, her voice a whisper. "It said I've been cheating on taxes, hiding money from my cottage rents. It's nonsense, but it knew my tenant's name, Mr. Grayson." Miss Marple's ears pricked. "Grayson a new name? How dreadful," she said. "Was it typed like the others?" Miss Barton nodded. "It's on plain paper, posted here." "I burned it. I was so ashamed." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes drifting to the typewriter. "That's a fine machine," she said, nodding at the desk. Miss Barton flushed. "Oh, that old thing. I haven't used it in years. It's from my time in London, typing letters for a solicitor." She stood, fussing with the cloth covering the keys. Miss Marple smiled, but her mind was racing. Dusty or not, the typewriter was here, and Miss Barton was nervous. She made a mental note. Check the machine's E. She stayed a few minutes talking about roses, then left, promising to return. The village was busier now, the mist gone. Mrs. Hartnell argued with the grocer over apples, her voice sharp. Two women whispered by the postbox, their eyes on the vicarage. Miss Marple walked slowly, letting the village's mood sink in. Fear was thick, trust thin. The letters had turned neighbors into suspects. And she felt the weight of it. St. Mary Mead was her home, and she'd fight to save it back home. She sat in her garden, the sun warm on her face. She opened her notebook and wrote, Miss Barton's. Typewriter, dusty but present. Letter burned, mentioned Grayson. Mrs. Calthrop, another letter. She thought about typewriters. The vicarage had one. She'd seen it in the study. Mr. Pye might for his invoices. Miss Barton's was old but real. 3 machines, maybe more. She'd need Raymond's help to narrow it down. She thought about Grayson, Miss Barton's tenant. A man renting a cottage could be anyone, a quiet scholar or a fox in hiding. His name in the letter wasn't random. It was a clue, like the crooked E. She made a note. Who is Grayson? The writer knew too much. Church funds, tax, records, Colonel Bantry's trips. They had access, or spies. She remembered Limstock, where letters hid a theft. Here, it could be money, or a secret tied to Grayson, or Mr. Pye's antiques. The clock struck noon, and she made a sandwich, her thoughts on the vicarage. She'd see the new letter soon, check its typeface. She also wanted to talk to Mary. The maid, why target a girl who barely spoke? Maybe Mary had seen the writer, or heard something in the vicarage's busy rooms. Miss Marple knew quiet people saw more than they said. She walked to the vicarage after lunch, her basket swinging. Mrs. Calthrop was in the garden, weeding, her scarf bright but her face tired. Jane, you're a saint, she said, brushing dirt from her hands. They went inside to the same parlor with chintz curtains. The new letter lay on the table, its paper crumpled. Miss Marple read it, her glasses low on her nose. It accused Mrs. Calthrop of lying to her husband, hiding money for personal gain. The dates and sums were there again. July, September, £12.06. The typeface was familiar, the E crooked. It's the same. Miss Marple said softly. Mrs. Calthrop nodded, tears welling. How do they know our collections? Like they're in the room. Miss Marple patted her hand. We'll find them, dear. She glanced at the study where the vicarage typewriter sat. May I look at your machine? Mrs. Calthrop blinked, but nodded, leading her to it. The typewriter was newer, its keys shiny. Miss Marple tapped a few, watching the E. It was straight, not crooked. This wasn't the one. She thanked Mrs. Calthrop and left, her mind buzzing. The vicarage machine was out, but Miss Barton's and Mr. Pye's were still in play. She'd visit Mr. Pye tomorrow, maybe admire a candlestick and ask about his office. She also needed Raymond's report. As she walked home, the village felt heavier, its colors dull. Mrs. Baker stood outside her cottage, arms crossed, glaring at Mrs. Weatherby across the green. A boy kicked a stone, his face glum. Miss Marple sighed. The letters were poison, and the village was sick. At home, she sat by her window, the green fading into dusk. Raymond stopped by, his face bright. Aunt Jane? I asked around, he said, sitting on her sofa. Typewriters are scarce. The vicarage has one. You know that. Mr. Pye's got an old one in his shop for receipts. Miss Barton's got one. 2, ancient, from her city days. That's it, unless someone's hiding one. Miss Marple smiled. Well done, dear. Keep it quiet, will you? He grinned, promising to help. She opened her notebook, adding vicarage typewriter, no crooked. E, Pye and Barton, possible. She thought about the writer. They were close, walking these streets, hiding behind a friendly face. The crooked E was her best clue, but she needed more. Grayson's role, Mary's story, the writer's motive. She remembered the figure. At the postbox, their uneven steps. A limp, maybe, or a trick of the dark. She'd watch again tonight, her eyes sharp. The clock struck 8. and she lit a lamp, its glow warm. She settled by the window, her tea cold, her mind alive. The village was quiet, but danger stirred in its shadows. Miss Marple was ready, her patience a weapon, her mind a trap. The writer thought they were clever, but they didn't know Jane Marple, and she was closing in. Chapter 5. A scandal unearthed. The sun rose over St. Mary Mead, its light weak through a veil of clouds. The village felt bruised, its usual cheer smothered by the poison pen letters that kept coming. Roses hung heavy on their stems, and the church bells rang with a hollow note. Miss Jane Marple sat in her garden, her knitting idle in her lap, a cup of tea cooling beside her. Her notebook was open, its pages thick with clues, typed letters, a crooked E, a shadowy figure at the postbox, and a list of victims: Mrs. Dane Calthrope, Dr. Haydock, Mary the maid, Mr. Pye, Colonel Bantry, Miss Emily Barton. Each letter was a wound, and the village was bleeding trust last night. She'd watched the postbox again, but no one came. The writer was cautious, perhaps sensing eyes on them. Miss Marple's mind churned. The letters weren't random cruelty. They were too precise, accusing Mrs. Calthrope of stealing church funds, Colonel Bantry of an affair with a London actress, Mr. Pye of faking antiques. They knew secrets or guessed them well enough to sting. She suspected a deeper game, like in Limstock years ago, where letters hid a crime. Here, it could be money, betrayal, or something tied to Mr. Grayson, Miss Barton's mysterious tenant. She sipped her tea, the cup cold, and thought about yesterday. She'd ruled out the vicarage. Typewriter, Itsy was straight. Miss Barton's old machine and Mr. Pye's were still suspects, their keys untested. Raymond, her nephew, had confirmed. The village had few typewriters, narrowing her hunt. But the letters kept coming, the latest hitting Colonel Bantry a bluff. Kind man who loved his roses and his wife, Dolly. The accusation of an affair was bold, and Miss Marple wondered why the writer targeted him. Power, money. Or a personal grudge. She stood, her joints stiff, and put on her gray coat. Today, she'd visit Dolly Bantry, who'd laughed off the letter but might know more. Then she'd talk to Mary the maid, whose letter about stealing seemed odd for a shy girl. Miss Marple tucked her notebook into her basket and stepped outside. The village was quiet, the green empty except for a dog sniffing the grass. Mrs. Hartnell stood by her gate, her arms crossed, glaring at Mrs. Baker's cottage. The letters had turned neighbors into strangers, and Miss Marple felt a pang for St. Mary Mead's lost warmth. She walked to Gossington Hall, the Bantry's grand house at the village's edge. The path wound past fields, the air sharp with damp grass. Gossington was stately, with tall windows and ivy climbing its walls. Dolly Bantry was in the garden, pruning roses, her hat askew. Jane, she called, waving her shears. Come, save me from these thorns. Her smile was bright, but her eyes were tired, shadows under them. They sat in the conservatory, a glass room filled with ferns and sunlight. Tea arrived, steaming in china cups, with scones and jam. Miss Marple nibbled, her voice gentle. Dolly, I heard about the Colonel's letter. Such nonsense. Dolly laughed, but it was sharp. Oh, it's absurd. An actress in London. Arthur's never looked at another woman. But the letter knew things: his trips to town, meetings with a dealer named Grayson. Miss Marple's pulse jumped. Grayson again, the same name from Miss Barton's letter. How upsetting, she said, her tone calm. Was it typed like the others? Dolly nodded, fetching the letter from a drawer. It was on plain paper, the typeface crisp, the E crooked. Miss Marple read it, her glasses low. It accused Colonel Bantry of secret meetings with a Miss Clara, funded by hidden profits. The details were vivid: dates, hotels, even a red scarf Clara wore. It's convincing, Dolly admitted, her voice low. But it's lies. Arthur's trips were for antiques, with that Grayson fellow. He's a dealer, bit shady, but Arthur trusts him. Miss Marple folded the letter, her mind racing. Grayson linked to victims now, and the letter's precision suggested inside knowledge. She patted Dolly's hand. "Don't worry, dear. We'll sort this out." They talked of roses, but Miss Marple's thoughts were on Grayson. A dealer tied to antiques and Colonel Bantry's trips could mean money-forged goods or worse. The letters might be a shield, stirring chaos to hide a scam. She left Gossington, promising to visit again, and walked back to the village, her basket swinging. The clouds were thicker now, the air heavy. She felt the village's fear, like a weight on her shoulders. Her next stop was the vicarage to see. Mary, the vicarage was a rambling house, its garden wild with daisies. Mrs. Calthorpe was out, but Mary answered the door, her eyes big and scared. "Miss Marple," she whispered, glancing behind her. "I'm not supposed to talk." Miss Marple smiled, her voice soft. "Just a quick chat, dear. Shall we have tea?" Mary hesitated, then nodded, leading her to the kitchen. The kitchen was warm, with a kettle, humming, and bread on the table. Mary poured tea, her hands shaking. Miss Marple sat her basket at her feet. "Mary, I know about your letter," she said gently. "It's not true, is it?" Mary's lip trembled. "No, ma'am, I never stole nothing. It said I took money from the church plate, but I only cleaned the pews." She wiped her eyes, and Miss Marple leaned forward. "Did you see the letter? Was it typed?" Mary nodded. "Typed, with my name on the envelope. I burned it. I was so ashamed." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind sharp. "You're a good girl, Mary. Tell me, have you seen anything odd?" "Maybe at night, near the postbox." Mary froze, her cup halfway to her mouth. I did, ma'am. A week ago, I was fetching water late, and I saw someone by the postbox. They were quick, dropping something in, then gone. I couldn't see their face, but they limped a bit, like their leg hurt." Miss Marple's heart quickened. A limp, like the figure she'd seen. "You're very brave, Mary," she said. "Don't tell anyone else, all right?" Mary nodded, her face pale. Miss Marple left the vicarage, her steps slow. Mary's story was gold, a limping figure, posting at night. It matched her own sighting, narrowing the writer's shadow. But why Mary? Her letter felt like a mistake, targeting someone too small to matter. Unless Mary had seen something, like that figure, and the writer wanted to scare her quiet. Miss Marple made a mental note. Protect Mary, dig deeper. Back home, she sat by her window, the clouds darkening outside. Her notebook was open, and she wrote Colonel Bantry's letter, typed crooked E, mentions Grayson. Mary saw limping. Figure at postbox. She added Grayson's name, circling it. He was a thread now, tying Miss Barton's tax letter to Colonel Bantry's affair. A dealer in antiques, possibly shady, living in Miss Barton's cottage. She needed to meet him, but carefully foxes didn't like being cornered, she thought. About the letter's pattern. They hit the powerful Colonel Bantry, Mrs. Calthorpe, Dr. Haydock, Mr. Pyen the Weak. Like Mary, the accusations were lies but believable, crafted to humiliate. Miss Marple knew lies like that needed truth to lean on. The church funds, the antiques, the trips to London, they pointed to money, maybe a scheme Grayson ran. The letters could be his shield, or someone else's, stirring trouble to hide the real crime. She stood, her joints creaking, and made more tea. The village was slipping further into fear. Mrs. Baker had stopped baking, her shop dark. Mr. Pye avoided the Blue Boar, where he once bragged about silver. Even the children were quiet, their games half-hearted. Miss Marple felt a spark of anger. St. Mary Mead was her home, and someone was tearing it apart. She'd find them, not with shouts or chases, but with her quiet way, watching, listening. Thinking, she thought about tomorrow. She'd visit Mr. Pye, check his typewriter, ask about Grayson. She'd also talk to Raymond, who was sniffing around for more typewriter leads. And she'd watch the postbox again, hoping for another glimpse of that limping shadow. The writer was clever, but they weren't perfect. It left clues, crookedy, the postmark. The limp hand Miss Marple was collecting them, like pebbles. The clock struck 6 and she lit a lamp. Its glow soft against the dusk. She opened her notebook, reading her clues. Typewriters Grayson, the limp, the letters cruel precision. She thought about Limstock again, where letters hid a theft. Here, it could be antiques, or blackmail, or something tied to Grayson's. Deals? She made a note. Check Pye's typewriter, ask about Grayson. She also wrote, Mary, keep safe. Outside, the village was still, the green empty. Miss Marple felt the weight of its secrets, heavy as the clouds. The writer was out there, hiding behind a smile, thinking they were safe. But they didn't know Jane Marple, whose mind was a trap, catching every slip, every whisper. She closed. Her notebook, her lips a thin line. The puzzle was growing, and she was ready for the next piece. She settled by the window, her tea forgotten, her eyes on the postbox. The night was dark, but her resolve was bright. The writer had stirred a scandal, but Miss Marple would unearth it, and St. Mary Mead would be whole again. Chapter 6. The nighttime shadow. The dawn broke gray over St. Mary Mead, the sky heavy with clouds that promised rain. The village was hushed, its usual bustle dulled by the poison pen letters that kept clawing at its heart. Roses sagged in gardens, and the church bells rang with a mournful echo. Miss Jane Marple sat at her kitchen table, her hands still, her tea untouched. Her knitting lay folded, the pale pink shawl untouched since yesterday. Her notebook was open, its pages dense with clues, typed letters with a crooked E, a limping figure at the postbox, and a web of names: Mrs. Dane Calthrop, Colonel Bantry, Mr. Pye, Miss Emily Barton, Dr. Haydock, Mary the maid, and Mr. Grayson, the shadowy tenant. Each letter was a shard of glass, cutting deeper into the village's trust. Last night she'd watched the postbox for hours, her eyes straining through the dark. No one came, but her mind hadn't rested. The letters were a puzzle, their accusations too sharp to be mere spite. They targeted Power Colonel Bantry's reputation, Mrs. Calthrop's church roll, Mr. Pye's antique sand vulnerability. Like Mary's quiet fear, Miss Marple suspected a hidden crime, like in Limstock years ago, where letters masked a theft. Here, it could be money, blackmail, or something tied to Grayson, whose name linked Colonel Bantry's affair letter to Miss Barton's tax accusations. The limping figure, seen by both her and Mary, was a solid clue. But it was the typewriter's crooked E that felt like a key. She sipped her tea, cold now, and thought about yesterday. Mary's story of a limping figure at the postbox matched. Her own sighting a quick shadow, dropping a letter, then gone. The limp was distinctive, narrowing the writer's shape. She'd also learned Grayson was a dealer, possibly shady, tied to Colonel Bantry's trips and Miss Barton's cottage. The typewriters were down to 2, Mr. Pye's in his shop and Miss Barton's dusty but suspicious. The vicarage machine was out, its E straight. Today she'd push forward, visit Mr. Pye, check his typewriter, and call Inspector Slack. The gruff policeman who'd scoff but listen. She stood, her joints creaking, and put on her gray coat and straw hat. Her notebook went into her basket, along with a pen and a few biscuits for Mary, who needed kindness. The village was stirring as she stepped outside, the air damp and cool. Children trudged to school, their laughter missing. Mrs. Price hurried to the post office, her face tight, likely sorting more hateful letters. Miss Marple walked to Mr. Pye's shop, her steps slow, her eyes sharp. The green was quiet, but tension hung like fog. Mrs. Hartnell snapped at the milkman. Tom, her voice cutting, Mr. Giles, the church treasurer, stood by the postbox, staring at it as if it might bite. Mr. Pye's shop was a treasure cave, its windows glinting with silver and glass. The bell jingled as Miss Marple entered, the air thick with polish and old wood. Mr. Pye stood behind the counter, his bright scarf limp, his hands fidgeting with a candlestick. Miss Marple, he said, his voice too high, looking for something special. His eyes darted to the door, nervous. She smiled, her tone warm. Just browsing, dear. That candlestick's lovely Georgian, isn't it? He nodded, rattling off its history, but his hand shook. She wandered the shop, her fingers brushing a silver tray, her eyes on a back room where papers were stacked. You must keep busy with records, she said, nodding toward the room. Do you type them? Mr. Pye flushed. Oh yes, I've a typewriter back there. Old, but it works. She tilted her head, her voice light. May I see it? I'm thinking of getting one. He hesitated, then led her to the room cluttered with boxes and invoices. The typewriter was small, its keys worn. She tapped a few. Watching the E? It was crooked, just like the letters. Her heart quickened, but she kept her face calm. Very nice, she said. Thank you, dear. She bought a small vase to keep him at ease and left. Her mind buzzing. Mr. Pye's typewriter matched, but he was too jumpy to be the writer, or was he? His letter about faked antiques hit close, and his link to Grayson through Colonel Bantry's deals was a thread. She needed to know more about Grayson. As she walked home, the village felt colder, its colors muted. Mrs. Baker's shop was still dark, her oven cold. Two women whispered by the church, their eyes on the vicarage. Miss Marple sighed. The letters were poison, and St. Mary Mead was fading. Back home, she sat in her garden, the clouds low. Her notebook was open, and she wrote, Pye's typewriter, crooked E. Grayson, dealer, Lynx Pye and Bantry. She thought about the limp. 'Twas her best lead, but limps were tricky real, faked, or just a stumble in the dark. She needed to see the figure again. Tonight she'd watch the post box, rain or not. But first she'd call Inspector Slack. He was skeptical, but he had resources, fingerprints, records. Men to watch the streets. She walked to the post office, where a phone sat behind Mrs. Price's counter. Mrs. Price was sorting mail, her hands quick but her face sour. More letters, she muttered, stamping an envelope. It's a disgrace. Miss Marple nodded, her voice soft. It is, dear. May I use the phone? Mrs. Price waved her through, and Miss Marple dialed the police station. Slack's voice was gruff. What now, Miss Marple? Another hunch. She smiled, unfazed. I saw someone at the post box late, limping. They posted a letter. Can you check for fingerprints? Slack snorted. A limping shadow. Half the village limps after. A pint and fingerprints. They're probably wearing gloves. She pressed on. Just check, please. And watch the postbox tonight. He grumbled but agreed, promising a constable after dark. She thanked him and hung up, her mind on the limp. Slack was right. Limps were common, especially among older villagers like Mr. Giles or Miss Barton. But the writer was bold, sneaking out at midnight. That felt younger or desperate. She walked home, the air heavy with coming rain. The village was unraveling. Mr. Pye had locked his shop early. Mrs. Calthrop hadn't left the vicarage. Even the children were quiet, their games abandoned. Miss Marple felt a spark of anger. St. Mary Mead was her home, and someone was tearing it apart. She'd stop them, with her quiet way, her sharp eyes, her patient mind. At home she made tea and sat by her window, her notebook open. She thought about Grayson, a dealer tied to antiques, living in Miss Barton's cottage, named In. 2 letters. Was he the writer, stirring chaos to hide a scam? Or a victim, targeted to keep him quiet? She needed to meet him, but Miss Barton was protective, and Grayson kept to himself. She'd find a way, maybe through Dolly Bantry, who knew his deals. With the Colonel, she thought about Mary's letter. Why target a maid? Mary's story of the limping figure suggested she'd seen too much, and the letter was a warning. Miss Marple made a note. Visit Mary again, ask about Grayson. She also wrote, watch Pye, check Grayson's deals. So the letter's pattern was clear: hit the powerful to sow fear, hit the weak to silence them. But the writer wasn't perfect. The crooked E, the limp, the local postmark, they were mistakes. And Miss Marple was collecting them. The clock struck 4 and rain began to patter, soft but steady. She lit a lamp, its glow warm against the gray. She thought about Limstock, where letters hid a theft. Here, it could be antiques, Mr. Pye's, fakes, Grayson's deals, or blackmail, with Grayson at the center. The letters were a distraction, like smoke hiding a fire. She needed to see through it. She decided to visit Mary tomorrow, maybe bring those biscuits. She'd also talk to Dolly Bantry about Grayson's antiques. And she'd check Miss Barton's typewriter, dusty or not. The rain grew heavier, drumming the roof. Miss Marple wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, her eyes on the green. Tonight, she'd watch the postbox, rain or not. Slack's constable might help, but she trusted her own eyes. As dusk fell, she put on a dark coat and scarf, her binoculars. In hand, the village was silent, the rain a steady hiss. She sat by her window, the lamp off, her gaze fixed on the postbox. Hours passed, her eyes heavy but sharp. At midnight, a figure appeared, hooded, moving fast through the rain. Thick. Their left leg dragging, and slipped an envelope into the box. Miss Marple's breath caught. The limp was real, the figure familiar, but the rain blurred their face. They vanished into the dark, and she sat back, her heart racing. She opened her notebook, her hands steady. Limping figure, midnight posted. Letter, she wrote. The writer was still at work, but they'd shown themselves again. She thought about the limp Meister Pye walked smoothly. Miss Barton was frail but even. Grayson was a stranger, his gait unknown. She needed to see him soon. The rain slowed, the village still. Miss Marple closed her notebook, her lips a thin line. The writer thought they were safe, but they didn't know Jane Marple, whose mind was a net tightening with every clue. The scandal was close, and she'd pull it into the light. Chapter 7. The hidden motive. The rain had stopped by morning, leaving St. Mary Mead damp and gleaming under a weak sun. Puddles mirrored the sky, and the air smelled of wet grass and earth. The village was quiet, its usual hum drowned by the poison pen. Letters that kept striking like wasps. Roses dripped in gardens, and the church bells rang with a tired chime. Miss Jane Marple sat in her kitchen, her hands still, her tea steaming. Her knitting lay untouched, the pale pink shawl stalled mid-row. Her notebook was open, its pages packed with clues, typed letters with a crooked E. A limping figure at the postbox, and names woven into a tightening web. Mrs. Dane Calthrop, Colonel Bantry, Mr. Pye, Miss Emily Barton, Dr. Haydock, Mary, the maid, and Mr. Grayson, the dealer in Miss Barton's cottage. Last night's watch had been worth the chill. She'd seen the limping figure again, hooded and quick, slipping a letter into the postbox at midnight. The rain had blurred their face, but the limp left leg dragging was clear. Matching Mary's story and her earlier sighting, it was a solid clue, but not enough to name the writer. The typewriter's crooked E was still her best lead, with Mr. Pye's machine a match and Miss Barton's untested. Inspector Slack had promised a constable to watch the postbox, but she hadn't seen one. Slack was gruff, skeptical, and likely thought her a meddling old lady. She smiled faintly. Let him. She'd solve this with or without him. She sipped her tea, the cup warm, and thought about the letters. They were vicious, accusing Mrs. Calthrop of stealing church funds, Colonel Bantry of an affair, Mr. Pye of faking antiques, and others of shameful secrets. Each was typed, posted locally, and eerily precise dates, sums, places. They weren't random, they targeted influence and weakness, sowing fear and silence. Miss Marple knew this pattern from Limstock, where letters hid a theft. Here she sensed a bigger crime: money, blackmail, or something tied to Grayson, whose name linked. Colonel Bantry's and Miss Barton's letters. The limp and the typewriter were tracks. But the motive was the heart of the puzzle. She stood, her joints stiff, and put on her gray coat and straw hat. Her notebook went into her basket, along with a few biscuits for Mary, who'd been too scared to leave the vicarage. Today, she'd revisit her clues, starting with Mr. Pye's letter about forged antiques. It stood out, tied to Grayson's deals and Colonel Bantry's trips. She'd also talk to Dolly Bantry about Grayson and check on Mary, who might know more about the limping figure. The village was crumbling, neighbors avoided eyes, shops stayed dark. Children played quietly, and Miss Marple felt a spark of resolve. St. Mary Mead was her home, and she'd mend it. She stepped outside, the air cool and damp. The green was empty, the postbox glinting wetly. Mrs. Price hurried to the post office, her arms full of parcels, her face sour. Miss Marple waved, but Mrs. Price only nodded, likely sorting more letters. She walked to Mr. Pye's shop, her steps steady, her eyes sharp. The village felt like a held breath. Mrs. Hartnell stood by her gate, glaring at Mrs. Baker's dark cottage. Mr. Giles, the church treasurer, shuffled past, his head down. The letters had turned trust to ash and Miss Marple's heart ached. Mr. Pye's shop was open, its windows catching the light. The bell jingled as she entered, the air thick with polish and dust. Mr. Pye stood behind the counter, his scarf dull, his hands twisting a cloth. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice thin. "Back so soon." His eyes flicked to the door, nervous. She smiled, her tone warm. "I couldn't resist, dear." "That silver tray from yesterday, May? I see it again." He nodded, fetching it, his hands shaky. She admired the tray, her fingers tracing its edge, her mind on his typewriter. "You must deal with many suppliers," she said, her voice light, "like that Mr. Grayson the Colonel mentioned." Mr. Pye froze, the tray wobbling. "Grayson?" "Oh yes, a London dealer, sells me odds and ends." His voice was too quick, his eyes avoiding hers. She tilted her head. "Your letter mentioned forgeries. Such a nasty lie." He flushed, setting the tray down. "It's nonsense. I bought a lot from Grayson once. Maybe not all perfect, but I didn't fake anything." His hands twitched, and she noted his fear. Grayson was a sore spot. She lingered, asking about candlesticks, but her mind was on his words. A not perfect lot from Grayson could mean forgeries, intentional or not. If Grayson was selling fakes and Mr. Pye knew, the letter could be a warning or a distraction. She thanked him and left her basket heavier with the vase she'd bought to keep him calm. The village was busier now, but tense. Mrs. Weatherby whispered to Mrs. Baker by the grocer's, their eyes darting. A boy kicked a stone, his face glum. Miss Marple walked to Gossington Hall, her thoughts on Grayson. Dolly Bantry was in her conservatory, surrounded by ferns and glass, sipping tea. "Jane, you're a lifeline," she said, her smile tired. They sat, the tea warm, the scones fresh. Miss Marple steered the talk to Grayson. "Arthur's dealer," she said. "What's he like?" Dolly sighed. "Odd man. Sells antiques, some lovely, some questionable. Arthur bought a table from him, swore it was Georgian, but I'm not. Sure, Grayson's charming, but slippery. Lives in Miss Barton's cottage, keeps to himself." Miss Marple nodded, her mind clicking. Slippery was a good word. If Grayson was peddling fakes, he'd want chaos to hide it, chaos like the letters. She asked about the Colonel's letter, probing for details. "It mentioned a red scarf," Dolly said. "Pure fiction, but so specific. And Grayson's name, tied to Arthur's trips. It's like someone's watching us." Miss Marple's pulse jumped. Specific details meant access, someone close, or spying. She patted Dolly's hand. "We'll find them, dear." She left Gossington, the clouds thicker, the air heavy. Grayson was a knot in the web linking Pye, Bantry, and Miss Barton. She needed to see him, but he was a ghost, rarely seen. Back in the village, she stopped by the vicarage to see Mary. The garden was wild, daisies bowing under raindrops. Mary answered the door, her eyes wide. "It's Miss Marple," she whispered, glancing behind her. "I'm scared." Miss Marple handed her the biscuits, her voice soft. "You're safe, dear. Let's have tea." They sat in the kitchen, the kettle humming. Mary nibbled a biscuit, her hands trembling. Another letter came, she said, for Mrs. Calthrop, worse than before. I saw it typed like mine. Miss Marple leaned forward. Did you see anything else, Mary? Near the postbox or here? Mary bit her lip. Not since that limping person. But there's a man, Mr. Grayson, who comes to the vicarage sometimes for church funds. He's quiet, but his leg drags a bit. Miss Marple's heart raced. Grayson limping. It fit the shadow, the letters, the web. You're very brave, she said. Don't tell anyone. All right. Mary nodded, her face pale. She left the vicarage, her steps slow. Mary's words were Gold Grayson, with a limp, tied to the church, the colonel, and Miss Barton. Was he, the writer, hiding a scam with letters, or a target silenced by fear? She needed to test Miss Barton's typewriter and meet Grayson, but carefully. Foxes sensed traps. The village was darkening, the clouds low. Mrs. Baker's shop stayed shut. Mr. Pye's blinds were drawn. Even the church felt cold, its windows dull. Back home, she sat by her window, the green fading into dusk. Her notebook was open, and she wrote, Grayson, limps, church visits, deals with Pye and Bantry. Pye's typewriter matches, Barton's untested. She thought about the letters. Motive. They hit leaders to sow chaos. The weak to keep them quiet. Mr. Pye's letter about forgeries was different, too close to truth, tied to Grayson's questionable goods. She suspected a financial scheme faked antiques, sold high, with letters to distract or blackmail. Grayson was the center, but was he master or pawn? She thought about Limstock, where letters hid a theft. Here it could be antiques or blackmail, with Grayson's deals as the prize. The limp was her best clue, now tied to Grayson. She needed to see him walk, hear his voice. She also needed to check Miss Barton's typewriter, though her frail steps didn't match the shadow's speed. The clock struck 6, and rain began again, a soft patter. She lit a lamp, its glow warm, and made tea, her mind spinning. Tomorrow she'd visit Miss Barton, admire her roses, test the typewriter. She'd also asked Dolly to arrange a meeting with Grayson, maybe at Gossington. And she'd watch the postbox again, hoping for another glimpse of the limping shadow. Slack's constable was useless, but her eyes weren't. She thought about Mary, scared but sharp. She'd keep her safe, maybe invite her for tea again. The letters were a storm, but Miss Marple was a lighthouse, steady and sure. She opened her notebook, reading her clues, the limp, the crooked E. Grayson's web. She added, protect Mary, meet Grayson, test Barton's machine. The village was quiet, the rain a steady hum. She felt the scandal's weight, heavy as the clouds. The writer was close, hiding behind a smile, thinking they were clever. But they didn't know Jane Marple, whose mind was a blade cutting through lies. She closed her notebook, her lips a thin line. The motive was near, and she'd drag it into the light. Chapter 8. A trap set, the morning sun broke through the clouds over St. Mary Mead, casting a frail light on the village's whetstones and drooping roses. The air was fresh, carrying the scent of damp earth and baking bread. But the usual cheer was gone, smothered by the poison pen letters that kept stinging like nettles. The church bells rang thinly, and the green lay empty, its grass slick with last night's rain. Miss Jane Marple sat in her garden, her knitting untouched, a cup of tea steaming beside her. Her notebook was open, its pages crowded with clues, typed letters with a crooked E, or a limping figure at the postbox, and a tangle of names: Mrs. Dane Calthrop, Colonel Bantry, Mr. Pye, Miss Emily Barton, Dr. Haydock, Mary the maid, and Mr. Grayson, the dealer whose shadow loomed larger with every clue. Last night's watch had confirmed the limping figure, their hooded forms slipping a letter into the postbox at midnight. Mary's mention of Grayson's limp had sharpened her focus. He was tied to Colonel Bantry's antique deals, Miss Barton's cottage, and now the church. A web of money and secrets. Mr. Pye's typewriter matched the letters crooked E. But Miss Barton's machine was still untested. The letters were vicious, accusing leaders of shameful acts and silencing the weak, like Mary. Miss Marple knew they hid a crime likely financial, tied to Grayson's questionable antiques or blackmail. She'd seen it before in Limstock, where letters masked a theft. Here the motive was close, and she was ready to force the writer's hand. She sipped her tea, the cup warm, and thought about her plan. The letters thrived on fear, so she'd use fear against the writer. With Inspector Slack's help, she'd spread a rumor. Miss Marple had received a letter revealing the writer's identity and would share it at the next Women's Institute. Meeting, it was a lie, but lies could flush out truth. The writer panicked, might slip visit the postbox, confront someone, or stop writing. She'd watch everyone, especially Grayson, Mr. Pye, and Miss Barton. The limp and the typewriter were her anchors. But the village's mood was her map. She stood, her joints creaking, and put on her gray coat and straw hat. Her notebook went into her basket, along with a pen and a few scones for Dolly Bantry, who'd help spread the rumor. She stepped outside the village, stirring but tense. Mrs. Price hurried to the post office, her face sour, likely sorting more letters. Mrs. Hartnell stood by her gate, snapping at the milkman. Tom. The vicarage was quiet, its curtains drawn. Miss Marple walked to the police station, her steps steady, her eyes sharp. The green was slick, the postbox glinting like a silent guard. The station was small, smelling of ink and tobacco. Inspector Slack sat at his desk, his tie loose, his face red. "Miss Marple," he grumbled. "What now? More limping ghosts." She smiled, unfazed. "A plan, Inspector. We tell the village I got a letter naming the writer, and I'll reveal it at the Women's Institute tomorrow. It's not true, but it'll shake them." Slack's eyebrows shot up. "A trap. Risky. If they're dangerous, you're in the line." She nodded, her voice calm. "I'll be careful. Will you spread the word and watch the postbox tonight?" He sighed, rubbing his neck. "Fine. I'll tell my men to gossip, and I'll stake out the box myself. But don't expect miracles." She thanked him and left, her heart quick. The trap was set. She walked to Gossington Hall to enlist Dolly Bantry. The path wound past fields. The air cool. Gossington's ivy-covered walls loomed, its windows catching the sun. Dolly was in the garden, weeding her hat floppy. "Jane," she called, brushing dirt from her hands. "You're a sight for sore eyes." They sat in the conservatory, tea steaming, scones crumbling. Miss Marple shared her plan, her voice low. "Dolly, tell everyone I got a letter exposing. The writers say I'll name them tomorrow at the meeting. Be shocked, but don't overdo it." Dolly's eyes widened, then sparkled. "Oh, Jane, you're clever. I'll whisper it at the grocer's, the Blue Boar, everywhere." Miss Marple smiled. "Perfect. And watch who reacts." They talked about Grayson, Dolly's voice tight. "Arthur's furious. Grayson sent a note yesterday asking to meet. About a new antique, shady man. That one. His limpsworth's lately bad knee. He says—" Miss Marple's pulse jumped. Grayson's limp, confirmed again. She made a mental note. See him soon. Check his walk. She left Gossington, promising to call, and walked back to the village. The clouds thinning, the trap was spreading, and she felt the village's pulse quicken, back in St. Mary Mead. The rumor took root. Mrs. Price was at the post office, whispering to Mrs. Weatherby about Miss Marple's letter. Mrs. Weatherby gasped, her hand on her chest. Miss Marple passed them, her face calm, her ears open. At the grocer's, Mrs. Baker was back, her apron dusted with flour, muttering to Tom the milkman. "Heard Miss Marple knows who's writing those letters? She's telling tomorrow." Tom's eyes widened and he hurried off, bottles clinking. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Dolly was fast and Slack's men were talking. The village was buzzing and the writer would hear. She stopped by the vicarage to check on Mary. The garden was damp, daisies perking up. Mary answered, her eyes scared but bright. "Miss Marple," she said, clutching the door. "Everyone's talking about you." Miss Marple handed her a scone, her voice soft. "Don't worry, dear. You seen Mr. Grayson lately?" Mary shook her head. "Not since last week. He came for church funds, limped out quick." Miss Marple nodded, her mind noting Grayson, still limping, avoiding eyes. She told Mary to stay safe and left, her basket lighter. The village was alive. Now, but brittle. Mr. Pye stood outside his shop, sweating despite the cool air, his scarf knotted tight. He saw her and ducked inside, the bell jingling. Nervous, she thought. Was it the rumor or his typewriters crooked? Mrs. Calthrop was in the church, arranging flowers, her hands shaky. Miss Barton canceled her bridge game, claiming a cold, her cottage curtains drawn. Dr. Haydock passed her, his stethoscope swinging, his face distracted. Ms. Marple watched them all, her eyes like nets, catching every twitch, every glance. Back home, she sat by her window, the sun fading. Her notebook was open, and she wrote, "Trap set, rumor spreading. Grayson limps, tied to church, Pye, bantry. Pye nervous, Barton hiding, Haydock distracted." She thought about the letter's motive. Fay hit power bantry, Calthrow, Pye too. So chaos. And weakness married to silence. Mr. Pye's forgery letter and Colonel Bantry's affair tied to Grayson's antiques, suggesting a financial scam fake sold high or blackmail to keep it quiet. Grayson's limp matched the shadow, but Miss Barton's typewriter was untested. And her frailty didn't fit the midnight dashes. She thought about Limstock, where letters hid a theft. Here, it was likely Money Grayson's deals, Pye's antiques, or church funds. The letters were a shield, stirring fear to hide the crime. The limp was her strongest clue, now tied to Grayson, but she needed to see him, test his walk, hear his voice. Miss Barton's machine was next, and she'd watch the village tonight with Slack at the postbox. The rumor would push the writers stop them or make them act. She made a note. Visit Barton, see Grayson, watch Pye. The clock struck 5, and the light dimmed, clouds creeping back. She lit a lamp, its glow soft, and made tea, her mind spinning. The village was a chessboard, and she was moving pieces. Mr. Pye's fear. Miss Barton's absence, Grayson's shadow, they were clues, not answers. She thought about Mary, scared but sharp. She'd protect her, maybe invite her tomorrow. The letters were a storm, but Miss Marple was a rock, steady and sure. She put on her dark coat and scarf, her binoculars ready. Slack would be at the postbox, but she trusted her eyes. The village was quiet, the green dark. She sat by her window, the lamp off, her gaze fixed. Hours passed, her eyes heavy but keen. At 11, a figure appeared, not limping but quick. Slipping a letter into the box, Miss Marple frowned. No limp. Was it a new player or a trick? Slack's shadow moved nearby, too late to catch them. She sat back, her heart steady. The trap was working, but the game was shifting. She opened her notebook, her hand calm. Figure at postbox, no limp, posted letter, she wrote. The writer was rattled, or they had help. She thought about Grayson, Pye, Barton. The limp was still her guide, but this new figure muddied the path. Tomorrow's meeting would shake. More loose. The village was tense, the scandal close. Miss Marple closed her notebook, her lips a thin line. The writer thought they were safe, but they didn't know Jane Marple, whose mind was a trap, closing with every move. The truth was near, and she'd seize it. Chapter 9. The Meeting. The morning sun struggled through thick clouds over St. Mary Mead, casting a dim glow on the village's wet cobblestones and sagging roses. The air was heavy, smelling of damp grass and faint smoke, but the usual warmth was gone, choked by the poison pen letters that had torn the village apart. The church bells rang with a hollow clang, and the green lay silent, its grass still slick from last night's rain. Miss Jane Marple sat at her kitchen table, her knitting folded, a cup of tea cooling beside her. Her notebook was open, its pages dense with clues, typed letters with a crooked E, a limping figure at the postbox. A new figure without a limp, and a web of names: Mrs. Dane Calthrop, Colonel Bantry, Mr. Pye, Miss Emily Barton, Dr. Haydock, Mary the maid, and Mr. Grayson, the dealer whose shadow grew darker. Today was the Women's Institute meeting where her trap would spring. Last night she'd seen a figure at the postbox, quick and without a limp, posting a letter while Inspector Slack watched too late to catch them. It muddied her picture. The limping figure, tied to Grayson by Mary and Dolly Bantry, had been her anchor. Was this new figure a partner, a decoy, or the writer adapting? Her rumor, spread by Dolly and Slacksman, had worked. The village buzzed that Miss Marple had a letter naming the writer to be revealed today. It was a lie, but it had rattled the village. Mr. Pye was sweating. Miss Barton had hidden. Dr. Haydock was distracted, and Grayson stayed out of sight. Watched them all at the meeting, her eyes sharp for guilt or fear. She sipped her tea, cold now, and thought about the letters. They were cruel, accusing Colonel Bantry of an affair, Mrs. Calthrop of stealing church funds, Mr. Pye of faking antiques, and Mary of theft. They hit power too, so chaos and weakness to silence. She suspected a financial scam, Grayson's shady antique deals linked to Pye and Bantry, or blackmail to hide it. The crooked E pointed to Pye's typewriter, but Miss Barton's machine was untested. Grayson's limp matched the shadow, but the new figure last night suggested a twist. Like in Limstock, where letters hid a theft, these masked something: money, secrets, or both. She stood, her joints stiff, and put on her gray coat and straw hat. Her notebook went into her basket with a pen and biscuits for Mary, who'd be at the meeting with Mrs. Calthrop. She'd speak today, claiming knowledge of the writer's motive to push the trap further. Slack would be there, watching the crowd. She stepped outside, the village tense. Mrs. Price hurried to the post office, her face sour, likely sorting more letters. Mrs. Hartnell stood by her gate, whispering to Mrs. Weatherby, their eyes on the vicarage. The rumor had spread like fire, and the village was a pot ready to boil. The Women's Institute Hall was a short walk, past the church and the green. The post box stood red and silent, a witness to her clues. The hall was old, its wood polished, its air thick with lavender and nerves. Women filled the room, their voices low but sharp, like bees before a storm. Miss Marple slipped in, taking a seat near the back. Mrs. Weatherby was at the podium, talking about the summer fair, but her eyes darted to the crowd. Mrs. Calthrop sat by Mary, her scarf bright but her face pale. Mary clutched a handkerchief, her eyes down. Mr. Pye was there, unusual for him, his scarf knotted tight, his hands twitching. Miss Barton sat alone, her face pinched, her handbag clutched. Dr. Haydock stood by the door, his arms crossed, his jaw set. No sign of Grayson. Miss Marple watched, her face calm, her mind a trap. The rumor had drawn them, their fear a map. Pye's sweat, Barton's grip, Haydock's frown, they were pieces. She leaned toward Mrs. Baker beside her and whispered, "Such a shame about these letters." Mrs. Baker nodded, her voice low. "Heard you got one, Miss Marple? Naming?" The writer, Miss Marple smiled faintly. "We'll see, dear." The rumor was alive, and the room felt it. Mrs. Weatherby finished, and the room hushed as Miss Marple stood, her small frame steady. "Ladies, gentlemen," she said, her voice clear, "these letters have hurt us all. Learn their purpose, not just spite, but a shield for a financial scandal tied to forged antiques and blackmail." She paused, her eyes sweeping. The crowd, gasps rippled. Mr. Pye's face went white, his hands gripping his chair. Miss Barton gasped, her handbag slipping. Mrs. Calthrop clutched Mary's arm, her eyes wide. Dr. Haydock shifted, his frown deeper. Miss Marple continued, I know the writer's motive, and soon their name. We'll end this together. It was bold, half-true, but it landed like a stone in a pond. The room erupted, voices overlapping. Mrs. Weatherby called for order, but no one listened. Miss Marple sat, her heart steady, watching. Mr. Pye was shaking, his eyes on the door. Miss Barton stood, trembling, her voice shrill. I can't let this go on, she cried, clutching her handbag. It's wrote the letters. I wanted to expose sinners. The crowd froze, gasps turning to whispers. Mrs. Calthrop stared, her mouth open. Mary shrank back. Slack, by the wall, stepped forward. His eyes narrow, Miss Marple's pulse jumped, but her face stayed calm. Miss Barton, the writer. Her frail frame, her quiet life didn't fit. The limping figure, the midnight dashes, the typewriter's crisp keys. Miss Barton was too weak, too slow. Her confession was a shield, protecting someone. Miss Marple thought of Grayson, her tenant, whose limp matched the shadow. Was Barton covering for him? She leaned toward Slack, whispering, Don't arrest her yet. Watch her and Grayson. Slack nodded, his jaw tight. The meeting broke into chaos, women crowding Miss Barton, some angry, some pitying. Mr. Pye slipped out, his scarf trailing. Dr. Haydock stayed, talking to Slack, his voice low. Miss watched, her mind racing. Miss Barton's outburst was a crack, but not the truth. The writer was close, panicked by her speech. She'd pushed them, and they'd stumbled. Now she'd follow the thread. Barton's typewriter, Grayson's limp, Pye's fear. She approached Miss Barton, who sat, tears streaming, Mrs. Weatherby patting her arm. Emily, dear, Miss Marple said, her voice soft. You're very brave. Shall we talk at your cottage? Miss Barton nodded, her eyes scared but relieved. Miss Marple helped her up, her basket swinging, and they left the hall. The crowds, eyes heavy. Slack followed at a distance, his hat low. The village was alive, whispers flying like sparks. Mrs. Price stood by the post office, staring. Mrs. Baker hurried to the grocer's, her voice loud. Miss Marple felt the tension, like a string about to snap. At Miss Barton's cottage. The air was thick with lavender and fear. The typewriter sat in the parlor, its keys dusty. Miss Barton poured tea, her hands shaking. I didn't mean harm, she said, her voice thin. I thought I was doing right. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes on the machine. Emily, you didn't write them, did you? She said gently. Miss Barton froze, her cup clattering. I had to say it to protect him. Her voice broke and she covered her face. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice kind but firm. Mr. Grayson, Miss Barton nodded, tears falling. He's my tenant, but more. He's been kind, helped with money. He said the letters were to stop a worse crime, but I didn't know. She trailed off, sobbing. Miss Marple patted her hand, her mind sharp. Grayson, the limping dealer, was the key. The letters were his, hiding his scams, forged antiques, blackmail, maybe church funds. Miss Barton was his shield, loyal but blind. She stood, her joints creaking. Rest, Emily. We'll fix this. She glanced at the typewriter. It's dust. Too thick for recent use. It wasn't the one. Pye's machine was still the match. She left, promising to return, and met Slack outside. Grayson, she said, her voice low. He's the writer, or close. Watch his cottage. Check Pye's shop. Slack nodded, his face grim. I'll get men on it. You're stirring a hornet's nest, Miss Marple. She smiled faintly. Better than letting it sting. Back home, she sat by her window. The clouds dark. Her notebook was open, and she wrote, Barton confessed, false, protecting Grayson. Pye's typewriter matches. Grayson, limping, likely writer. She thought about the meeting. Pye's panic, Barton's sacrifice, Haydock's frowned. They were pieces pointing to Grayson. The non-limping figure last night was a decoy, or a helper, maybe Pye. Scared but tied to Grayson's deals. She made a note. Check Grayson's cottage pies records. The clock struck 3 and rain began to patter. She lit a lamp, its glow warm. The village was a storm, and she'd lit the spark. Grayson was the center, his limp, the clue, his deals, the motive. She'd visit his cottage tomorrow, maybe with slack. She thought of Mary, scared but safe. She'd protect her, and St. Mary. Mead. The letters were a mask, but Miss Marple was peeling it off. Layer by layer she settled by her window, her tea cold, her eyes on the green. The rain fell harder, but her mind was clear. The writer was cornered, their steps faltering. They thought they were clever, but they didn't know Jane Marple, whose mind was a net, tightening with every clue. The scandal was breaking, and she'd drag it into the light. Chapter 10. The True Culprit. The afternoon sky hung heavy over St. Mary Mead. Its clouds dark and swollen, casting a gloom on the village's wet stones and wilted roses. The air was thick, smelling of rain and earth, but the usual hum of life was gone, crushed by the poisoned pen letters that had ripped through trust and turned neighbors into shadows. The church bells were silent, and the green lay empty, its grass slick and cold. Miss Jane Marple sat in her parlor, her knitting folded, a cup of tea untouched on the table. Her notebook was open, its pages packed with clues, typed letters with a crooked E. A limping figure at the postbox, a non-limping decoy, and a knot of names: Mrs. Dane Calthrop, Colonel Bantry, Mr. Pye, Miss Emily Barton, Dr. Haydock, Mary the maid, and Mr. Grayson the dealer, whose limp and deals pointed to the heart of the scandal. Today she'd unravel the truth. Yesterday's Women's Institute meeting had cracked the case open. Her trapper rumor that she'd received a letter naming the writer had pushed Miss Barton to confess, claiming she wrote the letters to expose sinners. Miss Marple knew it was a lie. Miss Barton's frail frame and dusty typewriter didn't fit the midnight dashes or the crisp, cruel letters. She'd confessed to shield someone, Mr. Grayson, her tenant, whose limp matched the postbox. Shadow Mary and Miss Marple had seen. Grayson was tied to Colonel Bantry's antiques, Mr. Pye's shop, and whispers of church funds. A web of money and deceit. Mr. Pye's typewriter matched the crooked E, but Miss Barton's loyalty to Grayson was the key that turned the lock. She sipped her tea, cold now, and thought about the letters. They were vicious, accusing Colonel Bantry of an affair, Mrs. Calthrop of stealing church funds, Mr. Pye of faking antiques, Mary of theft, and others of shameful secrets. They hit leaders to sow chaos and the weak to silence them. Like in Limstock, where letters hid a theft. These masked a crime, likely Grayson's forged antiques or blackmail to keep it quiet. The limping figure was Grayson, she was sure, but the non-limping figure last night suggested a helper. Maybe Pye, tied to Grayson's deals. Miss Barton's confession had confirmed Grayson's role. And now Miss Marple would prove it. She stood, her joints creaking, and put on her gray coat and straw hat. Her notebook went into her basket with a pen and a few biscuits for Miss Barton, who needed comfort. She'd visit Miss Barton's cottage, check the typewriter herself, and press for more about Grayson. Inspector Slack was watching Grayson's cottage and Mr. Pye's shop, ready to move. The village was tense, the rumor still burning. Miss Marple knew the writer, and the truth was coming. She stepped outside, the air cool and damp. Mrs. Price was at the post office, her face tight, sorting mail with quick hands. Mrs. Hartnell whispered to Mrs. Weatherby by the green, their eyes darting. The village was a coiled spring, and Miss Marple was ready to let it snap. The walk to Miss Barton's cottage was short, past the church where daisies bowed under the wet. The cottage was small, its curtains lace, its garden tidy despite the gloom. Miss Marple knocked, and Miss Barton answered, her gray hair loose, her eyes red from crying. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice thin, "I didn't expect you." Her hands twisted a handkerchief, and she stepped aside. The parlor was warm, smelling of lavender and wax, the typewriter still on the desk, its cloth askew. Miss Marple smiled, her voice soft. I brought biscuits, Emily. Shall we have tea? They sat, the teacups clinking, the fire crackling. Miss Barton was quiet, her face pale. Miss Marple nibbled a biscuit, her eyes on the typewriter. Emily, she said gently, you were brave yesterday, but you didn't write those letters, did you? Miss Barton's cup rattled, her eyes wide. I had to say it, she whispered, tears spilling. For him, Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice kind but firm. Mr. Grayson. Spartan nodded, her hands shaking. It's been good to me, paid the rent when I was short. He said the letters were to stop a bigger wrong, but I didn't know how bad they'd hurt. Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her face stayed calm. What wrong, dear? Miss Barton wiped her eyes. He didn't say much. Something about antiques, money owed, people cheating him. He typed the letters here late, when I was asleep. Saw him once, limping to the postbox. Miss Marple nodded, her mind sharp. Grayson, the limping writer, using Miss Barton's loyalty. To hide his work, she glanced at the typewriter. May I see your machine, Emily? Miss Barton hesitated, then nodded, leading her to the desk. The typewriter was old, its keys dusty, the ribbon faded. Miss Marple tapped a few keys, watching the E. It was straight, not crooked. This wasn't the machine Mr. Pye's was still the match, but Grayson had typed here, Miss Barton said. Where was the other typewriter? Miss Marple's mind raced. Grayson must have another hidden or used Pye's. She smiled at Miss Barton. Thank you, dear. You've helped more than you know. Miss Barton sobbed, her face in her hands. I didn't mean to hurt anyone, Miss Marple patted. Her arm. Rest, Emily. It's nearly over. She stood, her basket swinging, and stepped outside. The village was quiet, the clouds darker. Slack was by the church, his hat low, watching Miss Barton's cottage. She approached, her voice low. Grayson typed the letters here, but not on her machine. Check pie shop and Grayson's rooms. He's the one limping, dealing in fakes. Slack's eyes narrowed. You're sure? She nodded, her lips a thin line. Sure as rain. Move fast, before he runs. Slack tipped his hat and strode off. His boots splashing. Miss Marple walked home. The village heavy around her. Mrs. Baker was at her shop, her oven cold, whispering to Tom the milkman. Mrs. Calthrop stood by the vicarage gate, her scarf dull, her eyes tired. Mr. Pye's shop was locked, its blinds down. The rumor had shaken them all, and Grayson's shadow loomed. Miss Marple felt the scandal's weight-forged antiques, blackmail, church money siphoned. Grayson had used the letters to distract, to scare, to silence, but he'd underestimated St. Mary Mead. And her dot at home, she sat by her window, the green fading into dusk. Her notebook was open, and she wrote, Barton confirms Grayson typed. Letters, not her machine. Pye's typewriter matches. Grayson's limp, antique deals, church funds. She thought about the non-limping figure. A helper, maybe Pye, tied to Grayson's scams. Or a trick to confuse her. She made a note, search Grayson's cottage, Pye's records. The letters were Grayson's shield, hiding his crimes fakes. Sold to Bantry, money skimmed from church. Blackmail to keep Pye quiet. She thought about Limstock, where letters hid a theft. Here it was Grayson's empire antics, money, fear. The limp was her proof, with Mary and Dolly's stories. Miss Barton's loyalty was his armor, but it was cracking. She needed to see Grayson's cottage, his papers, his typewriter. Slack would find it, or she would. She thought of Mary, scared, but key. She'd visit her tomorrow, keep her safe. The clock struck 5, and rain began to fall, soft but steady. She lit a lamp, its glow warm against the gray. The village was a storm, and she'd lit the lightning. Grayson was the center. His limp, the clue, his deals, the motive. She thought of Pye sweating locked away. Was he a victim or Grayson's pawn? She made a note. Talk to Pye, check his fear. The letters were a mask, and she was tearing it off. She stood, her joints stiff, and made tea, her mind spinning. The village was quiet, but danger stirred. Slack's men were moving, watching Grayson's cottage pie shop. She thought of Miss Barton, crying but free. She'd saved her, and now she'd save St. Mary Mead. The writer had stirred chaos. But Miss Marple was order, her mind a trap catching every slip. As dusk deepened, Raymond stopped by, his face bright. Aunt Jane, Slack's men are at Grayson's, found papers, a typewriter in the attic. Pie's talking, scared stiff. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "Good, dear. Tell Slack I'll come tomorrow." Raymond nodded, leaving with a grin. Okay. She sat back, her tea cold, her heart steady. The net was closing. Grayson thought he was clever, but he didn't know Jane Marple, whose patience was a blade, cutting through lies. The scandal was hers, and she'd lay it bare. Chapter 11. Justice served. The morning light crept over St. Mary Mead, pale and hesitant, as if unsure of the village's mood. The clouds had parted, leaving a soft blue sky, but the air was cool, carrying the scent of wet grass and fading roses. The church bells rang gently, a hopeful note after weeks of gloom. Miss Jane Marple sat in her parlor, her knitting folded, a cup of tea steaming on the table. Her notebook was closed, its pages full of clues that had led her to the truth, typed letters with a crooked E, a limping figure at the postbox, K, a web of names, Mrs. Dane Calthrop, Colonel Bantry, Mr. Pye, Miss Emily Barton, Dr. Haydock, Mary the maid, and Mr. Grayson, the dealer whose forged antiques and blackmail had torn the village apart. The scandal was over, and justice was here yesterday. Miss Barton's false confession at the Women's Institute had cracked the case. She'd claimed to write the letters to shield Grayson, her tenant, whose limp matched the shadow Miss Marple. And Mary saw Grayson had used her loyalty typing letters on a hidden machine, not her dusty one, to hide his crimes, forged antiques sold to Colonel Bantry. Money skimmed from church funds, blackmail to silence Mr. Pye. Mr. Pye's typewriter matched the crooked E, but Grayson was the mastermind, his limp and deals the heart of the plot. Last night, Inspector Slacksman had raided Grayson's cottage, finding the typewriter, papers, and drafts of letters in the attic. Grayson was caught, and St. Mary Mead could breathe again. Miss Marple sipped her tea, warm and sweet, and thought about the end. Slack had called late, his voice gruff, but pleased. "We got him, Miss Marple. Grayson's in custody, singing like a bird. Pye's talking too, scared of jail. The typewriter, stolen from the vicarage months ago, was Grayson's tool, hidden. In Miss Barton's attic, papers showed forged provenance for antiques, sold high to Bantry and others, with church funds siphoned to cover tracks. The letters were Grayson's shield, stirring chaos to keep eyes off his scams. Mr. Pye, pressured by blackmail, had helped, posting some letters explaining the non-limping figure. Miss Barton, loyal and blind, had nearly taken the fall. She stood, her joints creaking, and put on her gray coat and straw hat. Her basket was light, no notebook today, just a few scones for Dolly Bantry, who'd want the full story. The village was waking, its pulse stronger. Mrs. Price was at the post office, smiling for the first time in weeks, sorting harmless mail. Mrs. Hartnell waved from her gate, her voice bright. The vicarage curtains were open, Mary sweeping the step. Miss Marple walked to Gossington Hall, her steps slow, her eyes taking in the healing village. The green was alive, children kicking a ball, their laughter sharp and free. Gossington's ivy-covered walls glowed in the sun, its gardens bright with roses. Ali was in the conservatory, sipping tea, her hat askew. "Jane," she called. "Jumping up? You're a marvel," Slack told Arthur. "Everything Grayson's done for." They sat, tea steaming, scones crumbling. Miss Marple shared the tale, her voice soft but clear. "Grayson was clever, Dolly. He faked antiques, sold them. To your husband, pocketed church money. The letters kept us fighting each other, not him. Miss Barton loved him like a son, took the blame to save him. Dolly's eyes widened. And Pye? Miss Marple nodded. Blackmailed. Scared. He posted some letters, used his typewriter. Grayson's limp gave him a whimmery, saw it, and I did. Dolly leaned back, her face awed. You're a witch, Jane. How'd you know? Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling. People are the same everywhere, dear. They hide, but they slip. A limp, a letter, a nervous glance, it's enough. They laughed. The conservatory warm, the village's shadow lifting. Miss Marple left, promising sherry soon, and walked back, the sun higher. Mrs. Baker's shop was open, bread baking, it smelled a bomb. Mrs. Calthrop was in the church arranging flowers, her scarf bright again. The village was knitting itself back together, thread by thread. Back home she sat by her window, the green alive with light. She thought about Grayson. He was no London dealer, but a conman, using charm and lies to build a small empire. He'd rented Miss Barton's cottage, paid her debts, won her heart. He'd used the vicarage typewriter, stolen quietly, and Pye's shop to type his lies, spreading fear to hide his thefts. The letters were cruel Bantry's affair, Calthrop's theft, Mary's shame but clever, hitting just hard enough to distract Grayson's limp. From an old injury was his mistake, seen by Mary and Miss Marple. Miss Barton's love was his shield, but it broke under truth. She thought about Pye, weak but not evil. He'd bought Grayson's fakes, sold them, then faced blackmail letters or ruin. He'd posted some, his step steady, explaining the non-limping figure. Miss Barton, frail and loyal, had nearly lost everything. Her confession, a desperate act. Mary, quiet but brave, had seen the limp, her letter a warning to stay silent. Miss Marple felt a pang for them, all victims of Grayson's greed. Healed by her patience, she stood, her joints stiff, and made tea, the kettle whistling. The village was healing, but scars remained. Colonel Bantry's pride was bruised, Mrs. Calthrop's trust shaken. Mary would jump at shadows, and Miss Barton might never forgive herself. Miss Marple knew scandals left marks, but St. Mary Mead was strong, its roots deep. She'd helped it stand, with her quiet eyes, her sharp mind, her steady heart. She thought about Slack, grudging but grateful. He'd taken Grayson to the station, Pye for questioning. The trial would come, but Miss Marple wouldn't go. I've done my part, she told herself, stirring her tea. The letters were gone, the postbox safe. She'd watch it tonight just to be sure, but the shadow was lifted. Grayson thought he was clever, but he didn't know Jane Marple, whose mind was a net catching every lie, every slip. The clock struck noon, and she sat by her window, the village alive outside. Children laughed. Mrs. Price chatted with Tom the milkman. Mrs. Hartnell hung laundry, her voice soft. Miss Marple smiled, her tea warm. The scandal had shaken them, but they were whole. She thought of Limstock, where letters hid a theft. Here, it was Grayson's empire, fakes, blackmail, stolen funds. The limp was her key, with Mary's eyes and Dolly's gossip. Miss Barton's love was the crack. And her trap, the rumor, had broken it open. She opened her notebook one last time and wrote, Grayson arrested, Pye confesses. Typewriter in attic, stolen from vicarage. Letters hid, forged antiques, church theft, blackmail. Village safe. She closed it, her hand steady. The puzzle was solved, the pieces fit. She thought of Mary, who'd need tea soon, and Miss Barton, who'd need kindness. She'd visit them, keep them close. St. Mary Mead was her home, and she'd guard it, always. The sun climbed, the village bright. Mrs. Baker's bread filled the air. And the church bells rang for noon, clear and strong. Miss Marple stood, her joints creaking, and looked out. The green was alive, the postbox quiet. She'd won not with shouts or chases, but with her quiet way, her sharp eyes, her patient mind. The scandal was buried, and St. Mary Mead was free. She settled back, her tea warm, her heart light. The village would talk for weeks. Miss Marple's trap, Grayson's fall, Barton's tears. But they'd heal. And she'd watch her window, her post, her knitting, her shield. The truth was hers. And she'd keep it safe for St. Mary Mead and for herself. Chapter 12. Peace restored. The sun rose gently over St. Mary Mead, painting the village in soft gold. The sky was clear, a bright blue that lifted the heart, and the air was warm. Carrying the sweet scent of blooming roses and fresh bread from Mrs. Baker's cottage, the church bells rang with a cheerful chime, echoing across the green, where sparrows flitted and children's laughter floated like music. The village was alive again, its wounds healing after the poison pen letters that had nearly torn it apart. Miss Jane Marple sat in her garden, her knitting in her lap, a cup of tea steaming beside her. The pale pink shawl was nearly done, its stitches neat, a quiet victory. Her notebook was tucked away, its pages full of clues that had brought justice. Typed letters with a crooked E, a limping figure at the postbox, and a web of names: Mrs. Dane Calthrop, Colonel Bantry, Mr. Pye, Miss Emily Barton, Dr. Haydock, Mary the maid, and Mr. Grayson, the conman whose forged antiques and blackmail had fueled the scandal. The storm was over, and St. Mary Mead was whole. The arrest of Grayson had sealed the case. Inspector Slacksman had found him in Miss Barton's attic, with a stolen vicarage typewriter, papers proving forged antiques, and drafts of the cruel letters that accused Colonel Bantry of an affair, Mrs. Calthrop of stealing church funds, Mr. Pye of faking treasures, and Mary of theft. Grayson, a limping dealer with a charming smile, had used Miss Barton's loyalty and Mr. Pye's fear, too. Hide his scams, selling fake antiques to Bantry, skimming church money, and blackmailing Pye to keep quiet. The letters were his shield, sowing chaos to blind the village. Miss Barton's false confession to protect him had been the crack Miss Marple needed. Her trap, a rumor of a letter naming the writer, breaking the case open. Pye, a weak accomplice, had confessed, and Grayson was gone. His trial set far from St. Mary Mead's roses. Miss Marple sipped her tea, warm and sweet, and thought about the village's recovery. The green was bustling again, children chasing a ball, their shouts bright. Mrs. Price stood outside the post office, chatting with Tom the milkman, her smile real. Mrs. Hartnell hung laundry, humming, no longer snapping at neighbors. The vicarage was open, Mary sweeping the step, her eyes shy but calm. Mrs. Baker's oven glowed, bread filling the air with comfort. Even Mr. Pye's shop was open, its blinds up, though his scarves were less bright. The letter's poison was fading, and St. Mary Mead was stitching itself back together. Thread by gentle thread, she stood, her joints creaking, and put on her straw hat, leaving her coat behind. The day was warm, and she wanted to walk to feel the village's pulse. Her basket held a few scones for Mrs. Calthrop, who'd need a friend, and a note for Mary, inviting her for tea. She stepped outside, the sun soft on her face. The green was alive, sparrows chirping, the postbox red and quiet, no longer a shadow's haunt. She smiled, her heart light. St. Mary Mead was hers, and she'd saved it with her sharp eyes, her patient mind, her quiet way. She walked to the vicarage, her steps slow, her eyes taking in every detail. Mrs. Weatherby was by the church, arranging flowers for Sunday, her voice cheerful. Dr. Haydock passed, his stethoscope swinging, tipping his hat with a grin. The village was waking, its scars softening. At the vicarage, Mrs. Calthrop was in the garden, weeding, her scarf a bright green that matched the grass. "Jane," she called, standing, her hands earthy. "You're a blessing." They sat on a bench, scones shared, tea poured from a thermos. Mrs. Calthrop's eyes were tired but warm. "I can't thank you enough," she said, her voice thick. "Those letters, I thought we'd never smile again." Miss Marple patted her hand, her voice soft. "It's over, dear. Grayson's gone, and we're stronger." Mrs. Calthrop nodded, tears glinting. "Mary's better, thanks to you." She's scared, but she's talking again. Miss Marple smiled, handing her the note for Mary. Give her this, will you? Tea tomorrow, just us. Mrs. Calthrop tucked it away, her face bright. They talked of daisies and sermons, the village's rhythm returning. Miss Marple left, her basket lighter, her heart full. She walked to the green, pausing by the postbox. It stood sturdy, no longer a threat. She thought of the limping figure Grayson, slipping letters in the dark, his knee betraying him. Mary's eyes had caught him, and Miss Marple's had held him. The crooked E from Pye's typewriter and the stolen vicarage one had been her map. Miss Barton's love, Pye's fear, Bantry's pride, they were pieces, fitted by her patience. She'd known scandals before, in Limstock, where letters hid a theft. Here it was Grayson's empire, fakes, blackmail, stolen funds. A trap. The rumor had flushed him out, and Slacksman had closed the net. She thought of the village's wounds. Colonel Bantry was quieter, his roses his refuge. Mrs. Calthrop's laugh was softer, her trust bruised. Mary jumped at noises, but she'd heal. Miss Barton, in her cottage, was fragile, her loyalty to Grayson a scar. Mr. Pye, free but shamed, would sell his shop, some said. Dr. Haydock was gruff again, his peppermint jar full. The letters had cut deep, but St. Mary Mead was tough. Its roots deep in shared cups of tea, Sunday hymns, and gossip over fences. Miss Marple had guarded those roots, her mind a shield, her heart a fire. She walked on, passing Mrs. Baker's shop, where bread steamed and customers smiled. Mrs. Price waved from the post office, her voice bright. No more nasty letters. Miss Marple, she called. Miss Marple nodded, her smile warm. Let's hope, dear. She thought of Grayson, in a cell, his charm useless. He'd been clever, using Miss Barton's love, Pye's weakness, the village's trust. The letters were his smoke, hiding his theft's antiques faked for Bantry. Church money slipped into his pocket, Pye blackmailed to post or type. But he'd slipped the limp, the typewriter, the too precise lies. Miss Marple had seen them, her eyes sharper than his schemes. She thought of her clues, the crooked E. Mary's story, Dolly's gossip, Miss Barton's tears. Each was a thread woven into truth. The limping figure caught by her binoculars was Grayson, his knee, his downfall. The non-limping figure was Pye, scared but obedient. Miss Barton's typewriter was a decoy, the real one stolen, hidden in Grayson's attic. Her trap, the rumor of a letter naming the writer, had pushed Miss Barton to confess. Grayson to hide, Pye to crack. Slack, gruff but loyal, had finished it, his men finding the proof. The village owed her, but she'd never say it. Her reward was the green, alive again, the bells ringing, the roses blooming dot. She reached home, the sun high, the village humming. She sat in her garden, her knitting in hand, the shawl soft under her fingers. The needles clicked, a steady rhythm, like the village's heartbeat. She thought of tomorrow. She'd visit Miss Barton, bring scones, listen to her guilt. Mary would come for tea, her shy smile a gift. Dolly would call, sherry in hand, to gossip about Grayson's trial. The village would talk for months, Miss Marple's trap, Grayson's fall, the letters end. But they'd heal, and she'd watch her window, her post, her knitting, her peace. She thought of St. Mary Mead's strength. It was small, a dot in the countryside, but it was hers. People flawed, kind, stubborn were her puzzle, their secrets her map. The letters had tested them, but they'd stood with her help. She'd known their hearts, their fears, their slips. Grayson had thought them weak, easy to fool. He didn't know Jane Marple, whose mind was a net, catching every whisper, every lie. She'd save them, not with shouts or chases, but with her quiet way, her sharp eyes, her steady heart. The clock struck 1, and she stood, her joints stiff, but her step light. She made tea, the kettle whistling, the kitchen warm with blue curtains and sunlight. The village was alive outside. Children shouting, Mrs. Hartnell laughing, Mrs. Baker's bread a promise. Miss Marple sat by her window, her tea warm, her shawl growing. The green was bright, the postbox silent, the church bells clear. She thought of scandals past and those to come. "There's always a scandal waiting," she murmured, her needles clicking. "One only needs to look." She smiled, her eyes on the village. St. Mary Mead was safe, its roses bright, its people strong. The letters were gone, Grayson's shadow lifted. She'd won, her patience a blade, her mind a trap. The truth was hers, and she'd keep it, for St. Mary Mead and for herself. The sun climbed, the village sang, and Miss Marple knitted, her heart full, her watch never ending.